can your zone 2 session be considered as an active recovery day? And what about those studies that tell us that active recovery is absolutely useless? I'm going to start with that second question because a colleague of mine sent me a post on Instagram yesterday. And that post was essentially saying that despite the fact that pro cyclists, for example, with the Tour de France happening right now, pro cyclists do some active recovery after their races. Pro swimmers do some laps in the pool between events during a day. They do that in track cycling as well. There's many disciplines where people do active recovery or use active recovery, whether it's in their training or whether it's before or after competitions, between competitions, and even a lot of amateur sports people that use active recovery and feel the benefits from it. But that Instagram post was saying that essentially, if you look at the literature, if you look at the scientific studies that have been conducted on the matter, well, there has been no significant physiological effect shown following an active recovery session. And because of this, active recovery is useless and you shouldn't do it. And passive recovery is always better than active recovery. And until you show me a double-blind controlled placebo study, I'm not going to believe your argument. That's essentially the tone of the post. I'll put it in the description. It's in French, but you should be able to tease out some the gist of it, and you might even be able to translate it if you're interested. And I think that's a huge problem, and it's a tendency that I'm starting to see both in the French speaking sphere and in the English speaking one. And for me, we're trending towards something that I would call Scientism, which is essentially using science or setting up science as an untouchable dogma to the same level that some people might do with religion. And I'm not putting everybody in that basket, because you can be a believer, you can believe in something, you can adhere to a religion without necessarily determining that this set of beliefs is absolute and unquestionable, okay? But this is the tone of the post, and I think that's a big issue, is saying that studies have said this, and until you show me a study that says different, then all your arguments fall flat, because science, right? Trust the science, for those that remember a few years ago and know what I'm talking about. And that's a huge problem. That's a huge problem, especially when we start discarding personal experiences, when we start discarding perception, right? And it was super interesting reading the comments on that post, because a lot of people, professionals and amateurs, were saying, well, I'm using active recovery after my hard sessions, after my competitions, and I feel the difference. It helps me feel better. It helps me recover better. And then the author of the post kept saying, yeah, but if there's no studies to show me, then your argument doesn't hold water. And I find that quite troubling. Because we have to understand that science and the scientific method is a fantastic tool to understand how the world works, to understand the mechanistic aspect of the world that we live in. But when you start saying that only science can tell us what is, you set aside the fact that science is imperfect, that science was never supposed to be used to say this is true at 100% because science said so. A colleague of mine, I did a video with him, I did a video on this channel about his recent published study on respiratory training and ventilatory strategy for cyclists. If you check that one out, Cyril Riquier, a good colleague of mine here in France, and he says that science is nothing else than protocolized, I can't pronounce that one properly, protocolized empiricism. Essentially, we're just taking field experiences, empiricism, practice, and then we're setting a protocol to try and control some parameters and extract some significant information out of it. But it remains an incomplete process, and it's also always going to be restricted by the measurement tools that we have access to, right? Way back, we thought that lactic acid or lactate was the cause of fatigue, simply because there was tired animals that we just hunted. They were tired. They had lactate in their blood. 1 + 1 = 2. So lactate causes fatigue. Later on, we figured out, once we had more more precise measurement tools, we were able to measure smaller molecules. We were able to measure inorganic phosphate in the muscle and hydrogen ions in the blood. And we were able to determine through scientific processes, we were able to determine that those molecules seem to be the cause of fatigue. And guess what? They come along with lactate. When lactate accumulates in the blood, we typically see an increase in those fatigue metabolites. So it's wrong to say that lactate is the cause of fatigue. But back then, when we couldn't measure hydrogen ions and inorganic phosphate, it wasn't wrong. It's just what we knew based on the information we had and based on the tools and the measurement tools that we had at our disposal. And I think it's a real problem when we start to put science on a pedestal and we discard personal experiences and we discard the perception, right, of people that practice the thing day in and day out. And there's so many good reasons for example, if you take pro cyclists in the Tour de France, so many good reasons to use active recovery. It does help them calm down from a nervous system standpoint after a big sprint. It does help them bridge the gap if there's a day with very little volume. For example, a time trial, they'll probably do some volume after that because they don't want too much of a gap between two big stages. And they also might want to do some active recovery so they can hide from the media and not be bothered after a stage that didn't finish how they wanted. For example, that's 3 reasons off the top of my head, and I'm not pulling those out of the bag. A friend of mine who works with pro cyclists in the Tour de France related those back to me. In addition to everything else that again, people say and feel that it's easier to recover after a hard session if you do some active recovery. You have less DOMs the next day, and maybe some people don't need it, but we cannot just say, well, the studies show that there's no physiological quantifiable effect, so it's a waste of time and you'd better lie down and do nothing. That's a huge problem in my opinion. Now, going back to the first question of this video, can you consider a zone 2 session as an active recovery session? The first thing to understand is that zone 2 doesn't mean the same thing for everybody, and especially depending on your level of endurance training. If we take a beginner in endurance training compared to a professional cyclist, well, zone 2 might be the same relative intensity based on thresholds, meaning the first threshold is the upper limit of zone 2. Typically, this is how it's determined. But if you have a first threshold at 120 watts or a first threshold at 320 watts, your zone 2 doesn't cost the same from a nervous standpoint, metabolic standpoint, psychological standpoint. So if you're a beginner, your first threshold's at 120, typically right at 100 watts at low intensity, it's an easy session, okay? But it's very different compared to a professional cyclist with a 320 watt first threshold that is riding at 300 watts. 300 watts is a lot of power. Yeah, but it's zone 2. No, it's not easy. It's hard. It's work. It takes a lot of calories to feed. It takes a lot of mental fortitude to hold, okay, for long periods of time, because you're going to have to do long sessions at those intensities if you want the benefits. So pro cyclists typically will do their long rides at 250, 260, 270, 240 maybe watts, because that gives them that margin and it allows them to do more volume, consume less calories, and still get the benefits. So for me, the distinction between a low intensity session, which is typically what we mean when we say I'm going to do a zone 2 session, and not everybody means this, but I would say that the majority of people that say I'm going to do a zone 2 session mean I'm going to do a low intensity session. And it might be zone 1, it might be zone 2. Remember that physiologically speaking, those two zones can be differentiated. They're both below the first lactate or ventilatory threshold. So physiologically speaking, you can't break them apart. So for me, how to determine if your low intensity session is active recovery or not, the best way is based on the goal of the session. What was the target for this session? Was it a target to just move a little bit and then not do anything, but not have any training or significant training load? Then you might do a 30, 40, 50 minute session, depending on your typical training volume, right? If you're used to 2-hour sessions, then you might do an hour. If you're used to hour sessions, you might do 20 minutes. And it might be a 1 out of 10 in terms of difficulty. And that would be considered to be an active recovery session. But if you're trying to accumulate a significant amount of volume at low intensity, for example, you're going out for 4 hours on your bike, you can't say, yeah, but it's a low intensity session, so it's active recovery. No, you're trying to build volume. It's going to take you more than 24 hours to recover from this, okay? Because we have that durability aspect to the long session, and this is not an active recovery session. You will not be recovered the next day. It will take some some bullets out of your cartridge, as we say, and you have to consider that as not an easy session, right? For me, there's 2 types of sessions. There's an easy session, and then there's the rest of it. And the rest could be a long zone 2 session, a zone 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 session. It doesn't matter. But once you start getting out of it's a short, easy session, then everything has to fall into the bucket of it's going to create some fatigue. Not all fatigue is equal, but it's going to create some fatigue. We're going to need some time to recover from it, and we need to consider that in our training plan. So to sum it up, active recovery or not for zone 2, yes, it is active recovery if you've decided that there was an active recovery session, and if you make sure that the intensity matches something that allows you to really not feel any fatigue at all from this session and recover easily for the next day of training. If you have any questions about this, about zone 2 or training in general, make sure you leave comments below. I'm enjoying reading all your comments and getting ideas for future videos. If you want some more information on conditioning, I have a free guide, 4 videos that I've prepared for you with some graphs and some fun animations. You can sign up directly using the link in the description. And of course, I will see you in the next video. Take care.